The Second Macedonian War commenced around 200 BCE, initiated by Attalus, the king of Pergamon, who sought Rome's assistance against Macedonia. This presented an ideal opportunity for Rome to involve itself in Greek internal matters. Roman troops soon made their way into the Peloponnesian Peninsula through Illyria, and some were transported by sea to Athens. Although many Greeks harbored resentment towards King Philip V and desired to free themselves from his rule, only a portion openly supported the Romans. The Aetolian and Achaean leagues formed an alliance with the Roman Republic and dispatched their forces against the Macedonians. Both sides possessed comparable forces, leading to a stalemate in the conflict. The situation shifted in 198 BCE when Titus Quinctius Flaminius, a skilled and youthful commander, assumed leadership of the Roman forces in this campaign. His strategic moves compelled Philip to engage in a major battle. Recognizing that he had minimal reserves compared to the Romans, Philip realized his only chance was to secure victory in a decisive encounter. This pivotal battle unfolded in the Cynoscephalae hills near Larissa in May 197 BCE.
I have prayed for a victory today. I have consulted oracles and witnessed omens, and through them I know the gods have given me brave men to lead into battle. Now, forwards! Victory awaits!
Titus Quinctius Flamininus led the Roman army, which, according to Plutarch, comprised roughly 33,400 soldiers. This force was organized around 2 legions, and when combined with Italian allies, totaled around 22,000 armed individuals. Additionally, there were light infantry units, including 6,000 soldiers from Aetolia, 1,200 from Athymania, and 800 mercenary archers from Crete. The Roman cavalry consisted of 2,500 horsemen, among them 400 from Aetolia and potentially 1,200 Numidians from Africa. These troops were further reinforced by approximately 12 elephants provided by Massinissa, the ruler of Numidia.
May all the gods preserve us from Romans and their appalling ways. In equal parts, arrogant, boorish, prudish, and dull, they give me indigestion just looking at them. To arms, and let's be done with them!
Philip assembled an army of 16,000 pikemen for the battle, drawing soldiers from various age groups across his entire kingdom. The prolonged state of warfare had drained his manpower reserves, compelling him to enlist both elderly individuals and young boys to fight against the Romans. Additionally, his military forces included 2,000 peltasts, 5,500 other lightly armed infantry, primarily consisting of Illyrians and Thracians, and 2,000 cavalrymen from Thessalians and Macedonians. The Thessalian cavalry was under the command of Heracleides of Jerton, while Leon led the Macedonian cavalry. Athenagoras led the mercenaries, with the exception of the Thracians, and Nicanor commanded the 2nd Infantry Corps. In the spring of 197 BC, the Roman forces received reinforcements of 4,000 heavy infantry and 1,000 heavy cavalry from their Greek allies. Under the leadership of Flamininus, they advanced into Thessaly, while Philip's Macedonian army moved south to confront them. Both armies initially set up their camps near the city of Phaerae. However, Philip began facing difficulties in supplying his troops with food, and the nearby town of Scotussa, with its abundant grain stores, became an appealing option. Consequently, the Macedonian forces started marching westward toward Scotussa, with the Romans following suit. Over the next 2 days, they proceeded on parallel paths, separated by a series of hills and ridges. On the 3rd day, with heavy rain falling and thick fog enveloping the area, the armies found themselves camped on opposite sides of a range of hills known as Cynoscephalae. Flamininus, concerned about the possibility of an ambush, ordered his Roman army to remain in their camp. However, Philip's soldiers were driven by hunger, and he decided to continue marching toward Skotussa despite the adverse weather conditions. Yet, as the fog grew denser, it became apparent to Philip that moving his army through such conditions posed a significant risk, bordering on recklessness. Faced with the choice between hunger and potential disaster, Philip ordered his Macedonians to pitch their camp. To address the hunger issue, Philip allowed half of his heavy infantry to forage for food in the vicinity of their camp. To mitigate the inherent risks, he stationed his light infantry and half of the Macedonian cavalry on top of Cynoscephalae, aiming to secure the ridge and keep an eye on the Romans. On the opposite side of the ridge, Flamininus decided to ascertain the whereabouts of the Macedonian forces. He dispatched 1,000 light infantry and 300 Roman cavalry on a reconnaissance mission to the top of the ridge. Atop the ridge, in the thick fog, the light infantry units from both sides unexpectedly stumbled upon each other, sparking a chaotic brawl. The fog severely limited their usual tactics of engaging in hit-and-run combat by throwing light javelins and then retreating before close combat ensued. Consequently, the fighting devolved into a confused, close-quarters struggle. Eventually, the cavalry units from both sides joined the melee, and the Macedonians' numerical advantage in both infantry and cavalry began to push the Romans down the ridge. Recognizing the dire situation, the Roman commander of the reconnaissance force promptly dispatched a messenger to the Roman camp, urgently requesting reinforcements. Upon receiving this plea for help, Flamininus sent an additional 2,000 light infantry and 500 cavalry up the slope. He opted for this modest reinforcement because the dense fog left him blind to the unfolding events on the ridge. He couldn't risk committing his entire force until he had a clear understanding of the Macedonian numbers and positions. The arrival of these reinforcements turned the tide in favor of the Romans, pushing the Macedonians back. Similar requests for reinforcements were sent to Philip, and the Macedonian king now faced the same dilemma that had confronted Flamininus earlier. However, Philip's predicament was compounded by the fact that half of his heavy infantry had not yet returned from foraging. He realized that the entire Roman army might be lying in wait for him within the fog on the ridge. As the fog dissipated, the Macedonians, who were making a desperate stand atop the ridge, became visible. The sight of his besieged troops on the ridge spurred Philip into action. He couldn't stand by and witness a portion of his army being annihilated, especially when he now understood that the opposing forces consisted solely of Roman light infantry and cavalry. In response, Philip swiftly sent an officer named Athenagros with 1,500 mercenary heavy infantry and 1,500 heavy cavalry to rescue their comrades on the ridge. These reinforcements drove the Romans back down the opposite slope in disarray. This retreat might have continued all the way to the Roman camp had it not been for the timely intervention of Greek cavalry. The Greek cavalry charged into the Macedonian cavalry, disrupting their advance. Subsequently, the battle transitioned into a static confrontation on the plain near the Roman camp. The presence of a significant Macedonian force near the Roman camp convinced Flamininus that it was time to engage in battle. He led the Roman and allied troops out of the camp, forming them into a battle formation. Placing his 20 war elephants at the forefront of the right wing, he ordered the legions to advance, causing the Macedonians to retreat back up the ridge. In the Macedonian camp, Philip was receiving reports of the successful rescue mission, but these reports were exaggerated by the time they reached him. They led him to believe that the entire Roman army was in full retreat, making him think that a decisive victory was within reach. As a result, Philip commanded the 8,000 phalangites in camp and 4,000 javelin thrower infantry known as peltasts to ascend the ridge. He also directed a court official, Nicanor, to organize the remaining phalangites, who were returning to the camp, and follow him as quickly as possible. However, when Philip reached the crest of the ridge, he realized that the situation was different from what he had believed. He saw his troops retreating uphill in the face of the advancing Romans. Recognizing that attempting to retreat while the Romans were approaching in battle formation would lead to disaster, Philip decided that it was time to confront the Romans head-on in a decisive battle for the fate of Macedon. Philip regrouped his cavalry and other retreating troops on the far right of his formation, followed by his peltasts. He then arranged the phalangites to the left of the peltasts and ordered both groups to form a double-depth formation. This meant that the phalangites were positioned 32 men deep, while the peltasts formed a 16 men deep formation. With this concentrated formation, Philip aimed to overwhelm the Roman left wing, which was advancing up the ridge. Flamininus, observing the Macedonians forming on the ridge, directed his left wing to advance and engage. However, he ordered his right wing to maintain their position on the plain just below the ridge. He was cautious because he had not yet identified the whereabouts of the entire Macedonian army and did not want to commit his entire force until he had a clearer picture of the situation. As the 8,000 Macedonian phalangites and 4,000 peltasts descended the ridge, they collided with the 6,000 heavy infantry of the Roman left wing, resulting in a fierce clash. Predictably, the Romans began to be pushed back down the ridge. This outcome was hardly surprising given that the Macedonians had a significant numerical advantage and were attacking from a higher position. Moreover, the differences in formation and weaponry played to the Macedonians' advantage. 2 Macedonian phalangites occupied the same width of space across the battle line as a single Roman soldier. Additionally, the sarissas, which were the Macedonian spears, were exceptionally long, measuring around 16 to 18 feet. These long spears allowed the spear points of the first 5 rows of phalangites to extend beyond their formation. When these factors were combined, it meant that each Roman legionary was confronted with the threat of 10 spear points. Some Roman soldiers attempted to hack their way through this wall of spear points, while others tried to push against the spears that had stuck into their shields. However, the latter method was a decidedly unequal contest, as one Roman was pitted against at least 2 Macedonians in terms of strength and weight. The mismatch grew even more significant when phalangites in the rear ranks leaned against the man in front of them, intensifying the pressure on the solitary legionary attempting to withstand this push of pike. Regardless of the approach taken, none of the legionaries on the Roman left wing met with much success. Simultaneously, as this disaster unfolded on the Roman left, the remaining Macedonian phalangites began arriving on the ridge in a piecemeal fashion. While the Roman left wing was gradually retreating down the slope, but it managed to hold the Macedonian phalanx in check. When Flamininus saw that the Macedonian left and center formations were arriving in a disorganized manner, he made the strategic decision to order the Roman right wing to launch an attack. Leading the charge were the war elephants, followed by Roman legionaries, Italian allies, and 4,000 Greek infantry, all surging up the ridge. Had the Macedonian phalangites at the top of the ridge been positioned in a battle formation, the war elephants would have been rendered ineffective since they couldn't charge into rows of spear points. However, the Macedonians on the ridge were still arranged in a column, with many struggling to ascend. The war elephants crashed into this disordered mass, causing the Macedonians to scatter in panic. They fled downhill with the elephants and Romans in hot pursuit. During this phase of the battle, both the right wings of the 2 armies achieved victory. As they passed each other, the rear of both formations became exposed to potential enemy attacks. Recognizing this opportunity, an unnamed Roman officer seized the moment. He ordered 20 maniples from the victorious Roman legion on the right to follow him across the ridge. These troops swiftly crossed the ridge and launched an assault on the left flank and rear of the Macedonian right wing. The Macedonians found themselves utterly unprepared to deal with this turn of events. Their training didn't encompass tactics for dividing their formation, nor were they accustomed to troops turning to face the rear. The Macedonian phalangites were essentially trained to move and fight in a single direction, forward. The surprise attack from the rear allowed the Romans to engage the Macedonians in close-quarters combat without having to navigate a forest of spear points. This proximity meant that the Macedonians were now within striking distance of the Roman swords, resulting in swift casualties. The Macedonian formation began to crumble almost immediately. Some phalangites were cut down where they stood, while others dropped their sarissas and fled the battlefield. Some Macedonians pointed their sarissas straight up into the air, which was traditionally a signal of surrender. Regrettably, the Romans did not understand the significance of this gesture, and the carnage continued. Only the intervention of Flamininus prevented a complete massacre of the Macedonians. Philip, accompanied by a small group of his cavalry, observed the destruction of his army from the ridge's summit. When he realized that the situation was hopeless, he fled with his escort back into Macedonia. At the Battle of Cynoscephalae, the Macedonians suffered significant losses, with 8,000 of their soldiers killed and another 5,000 taken as prisoners. In contrast, the Romans incurred relatively light casualties, losing approximately 750 men. Following the defeat, Philip took several measures to mitigate further damage. He burned his royal archives to prevent the Romans from gaining access to potentially damaging diplomatic information. He also dispatched envoys to Flamininus to request terms of peace. Philip recognized that his dominance over Greece had come to an end. The Roman conditions for surrender were demanding but could have been even more punitive. They included a complete withdrawal of Macedonian forces from all Greek territories except for the Macedonian homeland, the surrender of the Macedonian fleet, and the payment of a substantial war indemnity. Philip, left with no other viable option, accepted these terms. His once mighty army, the instrument of his power, had been decimated in the battle.